Hello everyone, tonight we're stepping into a world where houses weren't built to intimidate like castles, but to smoke, creak, and stretch like giant wooden lungs. Imagine architecture that didn't loom above peasants, but swallowed entire clans under one roof, with walls made of bark instead of stone, and privacy thinner than the mats hanging between you and your cousin. You'll see how survival worked when your wealth wasn't locked in vaults but dangling overhead in baskets of beans, when heating your home meant living in permanent smoke haze, and when your mother's clan, not your father's sword, decided who got to lead. Forget turrets, moats, and banquet halls. Here the aisle was your parliament, your kitchen, and sometimes your battlefield. From corn drying above your head like chandeliers of survival, to palisade walls bristling with sharpened logs instead of knights in armor, to the eerie reality that the entire universe was mapped onto your roof and hearths. These wooden structures were less about comfort and more about turning daily life into ritual. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy learning why your ancestors probably coughed their way through dinner. No pressure. And I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Drop it in the comments. It's strangely comforting to imagine someone in New York sipping coffee while another in Lisbon listens just before bed. So let's set the mood. Dim the lights. Maybe light a candle if you've got one, or just let your screen glow like a small hearth in front of you. The hum of a fan in the background can double as wind moving through bark walls. Take a breath. Let's walk together into a space that was never meant for one person, but for dozens, a place where smoke, wood, and kinship built a world stronger than any castle. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget your apartment with its IKEA furniture and the neighbor's dog that never shuts up. If you'd been born a few centuries back, east of the Great Lakes, your walls wouldn't have been drywall. They would have been bark, not metaphorically. Actual bark, peeled off elm trees and lashed into place. And before you complain about bad insulation, remember, nobody ever froze to death because their granite castle draft whistled through cracks in the stone. Castles were impressive, sure, but they were also cold, wet, and basically permanent reminders that you were just a tenant under someone else's armed balcony. A longhouse. That was homegrown architecture, flexible, communal, and about as subtle as a wooden cathedral lying flat on its side. The genius of the longhouse was that it was built out of what was right there. You didn't need a quarry. You didn't need oxen dragging blocks for 20 years. You needed forest, and the Haudenosaunee had plenty. Saplings bent into arcs made the ribs of the house, and sheets of elm bark became the skin. Everything is tied neatly with strips of fiber. You could practically hear the trees whispering, "You're welcome." Compare that with castle builders, who blasted entire hillsides into gravel just to stack something taller than the neighbors. The longhouse was humbler, but also cleverer. It bent with the wind instead of cracking under it. Now, don't picture it as some cute woodland hut with smoke curling out like a cozy fairy tale scene. These things could stretch up to 200 feet long, as if someone laid a cathedral on its side and told 30 families, "Yeah, you all live here now." And they did. Each clan had its section, each fire its place, each storage loft groaning under corn, beans, and squash. You weren't walled up in your own chamber pretending you didn't smell the moat. You were shoulder to shoulder with cousins, in-laws, and the occasional political argument about whose turn it was to dry fish. The longhouse wasn't about kings and fortresses. It was about mothers and clans. The women, not the men, owned the house. Matrilineal descent meant your claim to space came through your mother's line, not your father's swagger. If a chief became unbearable, the clan mothers could simply remove him, which, if you think about it, is still more democratic than most corporate boardrooms today. Castles, meanwhile, were built to lock power in stone. Longhouses were built to spread it, room by smoky room. And the smoke, oh, you'd never escape it. Hearths lined the center aisle, fires burning day and night. The roof had little smoke holes, but the bark flaps didn't always cooperate. Step inside and your eyes would sting, your clothes would smell, and you'd wonder if second-hand smoke was invented in upstate New York. But fire was life. It cooked, it warmed, it gathered people around it. Every family had its hearth, and every hearth was part of the spine that held the house together. Living in a longhouse meant you didn't get a stone tower with arrow slits, but you also didn't spend half your childhood hauling water upstairs or freezing in a damp dungeon. You got community, clan politics, and a fire that was never fully your own but always partly yours. And as you coughed in that smoky aisle, maybe you thought, this house isn't built to intimidate. It's built to include, which is why when Europeans arrived and bragged about their castles, somehow Denisoni shrugged and thought, all that effort for one family. How inefficient. But of course, a longhouse wasn't just architecture. It was a worldview hammered into wood and bark. And the way it was put together told you everything about how its people thought about life, survival, and belonging, which is where we need to go next, into the very bones of its design. So let's peel back the bark, literally. Imagine you're not sitting on a couch, but on the dirt floor of a skeleton made of trees. The frame of a longhouse wasn't carved out of permanence like a castle wall. It was bent into shape like a ribcage. Saplings, green, young, flexible, were sunk into the earth, pulled toward each other in pairs, and tied at the top so they arched like the back of a whale. Layer after layer of those arches stretched down the length of the house, giving it a barrel-shaped spine. No chisels, no mortar, no masons drinking too much ale. Just wood, fiber, and a willingness to let nature do the engineering. Castles wanted to say, we will last forever. Even if our owners don't. Longhouses whispered, we will last as long as we're needed, no longer. And that's the difference between stone and wood. Stone dominates the landscape. Wood blends into it. If a longhouse rotted after a couple of decades, no problem. The clan built another one, using the same trees their grandmothers had once leaned against. Try that with a granite keep, and you'll be bankrupt before your second harvest. And there's something eerily elegant in how temporary it all was. You didn't build a longhouse to outlive you by centuries. You built it to outlast winters, to host generations of your clan, to stand until the soil around your village wore out from farming. When that happened, you simply moved, packed your corn, rolled your mats, left the old skeleton to collapse gracefully back into the earth, and set up another one somewhere new. The house wasn't a monument, it was a cycle. Castles fossilized people into place. Longhouses let them breathe. Don't mistake temporary for fragile, though. These bark-wrapped spines of elm and cedar could take a beating. Storms came, wind howled, snow piled up, and the longhouse flexed like a bow under pressure. No cracks in the mortar, no collapsing towers. Think of it as architectural yoga: bend, don't break. A castle's wall was impressive until frost split it open. A longhouse, meanwhile, just shrugged at the weather and carried on smoking. Step inside and you'd see how clever the design really was. The outer bark covering wasn't just slapped on, it was layered, shingled, overlapping to shed rain. In winter, extra mats of reeds or furs could be hung inside the walls, turning the place into a giant communal thermos. And because the houses could stretch so long, they were like little indoor villages. A central hallway, sleeping platforms along the sides, lofts above, and fire pits lined up down the middle. You could walk 100 feet without ever stepping outside. Not exactly Versailles, but functional in ways Versailles never dreamed of. And that smell of wood, it wasn't just pleasant, it was protective. The smoke from the central fires seeped into the bark walls, curing them, keeping bugs away, making the structure last longer than bare wood should. Imagine stone walls that required constant repair versus bark that literally preserved itself with every meal cooked beneath it. Not bad for people who weren't trying to impress anyone with battlements. Castles were obsessed with height, towers stabbing the sky, thick walls daring you to try a siege. Longhouses weren't vertical. They were horizontal, stretched low and long across the earth. And that choice wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. One said, we are above you. The other said, we are with each other. But if the architecture itself sounds communal, wait until you see what went on inside. Because a longhouse wasn't designed for solitude, it was designed to cram your entire social life under one smoky roof. So here's where you realize just how serious these houses were. They weren't cottages, they weren't cabins, and they definitely weren't quaint log homes with flower boxes and cute shutters. A longhouse could stretch longer than a modern airplane, up to 200 feet, sometimes more. That's the length of 2 basketball courts laid end to end. Except instead of sneakers squeaking on polished wood, it was the muffled thud of moccasins on packed earth, and the hiss of smoke weaving toward the rafters. Width, about 20 feet across, give or take, with the roof arching 20 feet high. Picture it, a massive tunnel of bark and timber, not unlike stepping into the ribcage of some giant wooden beast. Except this beast was alive with the chatter of children, the crackle of fire, the coughing of old men, and the constant diplomatic negotiations of whose turn it was to stir the corn mush. Each longhouse wasn't built for one family, like a medieval manor where Dad sat at the head of the table and everyone else pretended not to choke on his roast goose. These were clan houses. Dozens of families, all tied by the mother's line, lived along the walls. Sleeping platforms lined each side like wooden bunk beds, raised off the ground and layered with mats and furs. Above them, lofts stored food: corn, beans, squash, dried fish, the sacred trio, and then some. You could look up and see your next 6 months of survival dangling above your head, and down the middle, that was the spine. Hearth after hearth, lined like vertebrae, each one shared by 2 families, each one with its smoke rising into the same long roof, trickling out of smoke holes cut above. Imagine living in a place where you could walk from one end to the other and pass half a dozen fires, each one cooking, warming, gossiping, arguing, laughing. The longhouse wasn't just a building, it was an ecosystem. Now, here's the kicker. The bigger the house, the bigger the politics. A 200-foot longhouse wasn't just about shelter, it was about the scale of the community. Every new family added length to the building. Need to expand? Easy. Slap another arch on the end, cover it with bark, and congratulations, your house just grew. It was the architectural equivalent of adding another tab to your browser. A little chaotic, but practical. Contrast that with castles. Add a new wing and suddenly you've bankrupted the kingdom, enslaved half the peasantry, and still ended up with drafts colder than a February ditch. The longhouse was expandable without catastrophe. It was literally built to stretch with the people who lived in it. And there's something eerie in walking that hallway, if you imagine it. Fires flickering every few steps, faces lit in amber light, shadows stretching along bark walls, children darting underfoot, elders wrapped in furs, women weaving, men carving, someone snoring, someone arguing, all of it contained under one roof. A single house, yes, but also a single world. That scale did something to identity. You didn't think of yourself as an isolated household, like the family in Castle A, hoping Castle B doesn't raid them this year. You thought of yourself as one rib in a long spine, part of something stretching far beyond your own fire. You weren't a room of stone, you were a length of bark. And yet, with all that size and communal warmth, it also meant one thing you could never escape: the smoke. Which brings us, quite literally, to the atmosphere of longhouse life. The heart of the longhouse wasn't its walls or its roof, but the fires that ran down its center like a glowing spine. Hearths were dug into the ground at regular intervals, each claimed by 2 families who lived across from one another. The flames provided heat against the northeastern winters, cooked every meal, and marked the rhythm of life inside. Fire meant survival, but it also meant smoke, thick, stubborn, and lingering like an uninvited relative who never left after dinner. Ventilation came from smoke holes cut above, with bark flaps angled depending on the wind. In theory, it was simple. Smoke rises, flaps open, problem solved. In practice, smoke had opinions. On still days it hung low, filling the longhouse like a fog and leaving eyes watering. Children grew up squinting through it, their lungs seasoned by years of breathing in fires that never quite cleared. Elders sometimes joked that if you could survive the smoke of your longhouse, you could survive anything. Yet that smoke wasn't just a nuisance, it was a preservative. It seeped into the bark walls, keeping insects away, warding off rot, and extending the lifespan of the structure. The rafters above turned black and glossy with soot, a record of decades of fires layered on top of one another. Every log, every pole, every bark sheet carried the smell of wood smoke, as if the house itself had absorbed its own history. There was also the matter of intimacy. A fire wasn't private, cooking wasn't solitary. Whatever you roasted, stewed, or burned became part of the longhouse's collective experience. A pot of corn mush simmering in one hearth could perfume the entire aisle, and everyone knew whose stew was watery, whose fish was underdone, whose venison smelled promising. Castles had kitchens hidden away in basements. Longhouses cooked in public, smoke binding everyone into a single olfactory contract. Fire carried spiritual weight too. It wasn't only for warmth or food, it was sacred, tended with respect, fed with offerings. Rituals often unfolded around those same hearths, songs rising with the smoke. The longhouse itself was sometimes described in cosmological terms. the roof as the sky, the floor as the earth, the central fires as stars. One was to live inside a small universe, smoky and alive, where every spark connected human survival with cosmic order. But no matter how sacred the flames, they still left soot on your skin and sting in your eyes. People moved through the house with smoke woven into their clothes, their hair, their very breath. The smell traveled with them beyond the palisade, a sign as recognizable as a clan symbol. This person belongs to a longhouse, and though no one ever forgot the sting, neither did they forget the comfort of gathering around a flame that wasn't just theirs but shared. The fire stitched families together, but they also revealed the deeper logic of longhouse life. These weren't fortresses meant to separate rulers from ruled. They were houses designed to gather many under one roof, no matter how smoky the air became. And if fire was the bond, then community was the blueprint. Which is why the longhouse stood not as a castle substitute, but as a different answer to the same question. How do people live together? What a longhouse never tried to be was a castle. There were no towers looming over peasants, no arrow slits glaring down like suspicious eyes, no stone curtain walls separating ruler from ruled. Instead, the longhouse inverted the whole idea of authority in architecture. It wasn't about fortifying one person's power, it was about housing many people's lives. The walls weren't meant to keep outsiders trembling at their thickness. They were meant to keep insiders together, breathing the same smoky air, eating from the same hearths. Privacy in this world was a myth. Sleeping platforms were divided by woven mats at best, so you could hear your cousin's cough at night, your aunt's whispered advice, and your neighbor's snores with the same clarity as your own thoughts. A medieval lord might have locked himself behind stone chambers, banquets in one room and scheming in another. In the longhouse, everything was on display. Disagreements, laughter, weaving, births, mourning, all of it unfolded in view of someone else. Solitude wasn't the point, cooperation was. Living this way meant the longhouse acted as both shelter and teacher. Children didn't grow up in nuclear families shut away in their own rooms. They grew up under the eyes of dozens of relatives, learning how to share, how to compromise, and how to argue without burning bridges. Clan identity wasn't an abstract word. It was the sound of your grandmother tending the fire 3 hearths down, the smell of your cousin drying fish overhead, the sight of your mother's sister weaving by the wall. A castle could outlive its lord, standing as a monument to hierarchy long after its builders had crumbled. A longhouse outlived individuals only in memory, carrying in stories of who lived in which section, who cooked at which fire, who laughed the loudest when the roof leaked. The architecture itself demanded remembrance. You weren't just an individual tenant, you were part of the collective ribcage holding the house upright. And it's worth noting that the absence of fortification inside didn't mean weakness. Fortification was there, just drawn differently. Instead of stone moats and iron gates, villages were often surrounded by tall wooden palisades, entire rings of sharpened logs planted upright, guarding not a lord's treasure but the shared lives inside. Defense was communal, not individual. The house protected everyone equally, and in return everyone carried the burden of keeping it safe. Even the very word longhouse became shorthand for community, diplomacy, and decision-making. When the Haudenosaunee Confederacy described their alliance as living together in one longhouse, it wasn't poetic fluff, it was literal political architecture. Imagine a European lord describing his kingdom as one castle. You can't, because castles weren't built for sharing. What the longhouse lacked in battlements, it made up for in belonging. And belonging had its rulers, to not kings in stone crowns, but women in woven belts who decided when to build, when to move, when a leader had overstepped his role. That authority didn't come from walls. It came from the very people who slept against them, which is why the longhouse was more than a building. It was a statement. We live not for fortresses but for kin. And that kinship was rooted, quite literally, in the matrilineal lines that owned the house, passed it down, and managed the politics that filled it. The longhouse might have looked like a barrel of bark and smoke, but the real scaffolding was matrilineal. Property, inheritance, clan identity, all of it flowed through the women. It wasn't the kind of symbolic power handed out in European castles, where a queen might be painted on a tapestry while men handled the business of ruling. In the longhouse, the women literally owned the roof over everyone's heads. A child belonged to the mother's clan, full stop. That meant when you were born, your identity, your lineage, and even your future in politics were tied to her line, not your father's. Marriage didn't change this. If a man married, he moved into his wife's longhouse, not the other way around. His authority in his children's lives was balanced, sometimes limited by the constant presence of his wife's clan. Try picturing a medieval knight, marrying a lady and then quietly moving into her house, setting up his bedroll under her aunt's loft of corn. That wasn't just unusual, it was inconceivable in Europe. But in the Longhouse it was daily life. Clan mothers weren't ornamental. They had the power to select and depose chiefs. If a male leader lost his balance, spoke poorly, ruled selfishly, stirred conflict, the women could strip him of his title and elevate someone else. It was a politics anchored in household reality. A leader who couldn't cooperate with his own people wasn't going to guide a confederacy. In a sense, the Longhouse doubled as both parliament and schoolroom, with women setting the rhythm and men learning the consequences of stepping off beat. This ownership wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The Longhouse itself was often described as a mother, long, sheltering, enclosing, holding generations in her ribs. Each doorway was a womb, every fire a heart. Step inside, and you weren't just entering a building, you were entering the body of your clan. Contrast this with castles. In Europe, property rights were tangled in patriarchal inheritance, fortified against women and younger sons alike. The castle wasn't your mother's house, it was your lord's. Its walls didn't nurture. They were excluded, defined by what was kept out. Peasants, enemies, sometimes even other family members. The Longhouse was the opposite, built not to elevate a ruler, but to sustain a lineage, to root authority in kinship instead of conquest. And because ownership was maternal, continuity was guaranteed. Wars could take men, hunting could take fathers, raids could fracture alliances, but the Longhouse remained in the hands of women, steady as the bark that wrapped its sides. A clan's survival wasn't measured in battles won, but in the fire still burning along its spine. The rhythm of life here wasn't dictated by stone walls or feudal law, but by the cycle of planting, harvesting, and passing the house on through generations of women. Each bark panel, each loft of corn, each smoke hole in the roof testified to ownership that wasn't signed on parchment, but carried in bloodlines and lived in daily practice. In this sense, the architecture of the Longhouse mirrored the social architecture of its people. To understand its matrilineal bones, you have to look at the land itself, the forests that gave it structure, and the climate that demanded its flexibility. Because the house was never just about people, it was also about the environment shaping them. Forests gave both the material and the logic. In the northeastern woodlands, stone was rare, iron was absent, but trees were everywhere, towering, pliant, and renewable. Elm bark peeled in wide sheets made walls and roofing. Cedar poles bent without breaking gave the frame its graceful arch. Where Europeans had quarries, scaffolding, and years of stone-cutting labor, people here had axes, fire, and the quiet patience to work with the living landscape instead of against it. Climate played its hand as well. Winters in the region were long, sharp, and damp, but not the kind that demanded granite fortresses or vaulted ceilings. What you needed was insulation and flexibility. Bark walls could be layered thicker in cold months, thinner in summer. Mats of reeds and firs lined the interiors, sealing in warmth. When a season grew harsh, repairs could be made quickly. New bark lashed into place overnight. Castles cracked in frost. Longhouses simply adjusted their skin. Mobility mattered too. Fields grew tired after a generation or two of planting corn, beans, and squash. Instead of clinging to exhausted soil with immovable buildings, villages shifted. Entire communities could abandon a site and rebuild a new set of houses elsewhere, carrying only what mattered most: seeds, tools, and memory. The architecture itself was designed to move with the rhythm of the land. A castle nailed its people to one spot, demanding loyalty to walls of stone. A longhouse let its people breathe with the forest, abandoning skeletons of bark to rot back into the earth as new ones rose elsewhere. Even the weather shaped the choice. Heavy snow would collapse a flat roof, but the curved ribs of the longhouse shrugged it off, sliding the weight down into the earth. Rain trickled harmlessly off bark shingles, layered like scales. Smoke holes opened or closed, depending on wind direction. The house wasn't indifferent to storms. It conversed with them. There's also the matter of resources. A stone castle devoured wealth, labor, and lives. Quarries gouged, peasants conscripted, years of toil for a single tower. By contrast, a longhouse could rise in weeks, the work shared by the very people who would live inside. No peasants, no serfs, no conscription. Just clans gathering timber, women preparing bark, men bending poles, and children running underfoot, learning by watching. Survival wasn't outsourced to a lord's fortress. It was built by your own hands, from the forest that had raised you. Seen this way, the architecture wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. Castles said permanence, we are here forever, carved in stone. Longhouses said resilience, we are here for now, and when the land tells us to move, we will. One is a monument to domination, the other, a contract with the earth. That contract shaped more than walls. It structured defense, politics, and even how people imagined safety. For protection, it wasn't moats or dungeons that mattered, but the strength of the palisade surrounding the clustered houses, and the collective resolve of the people inside it. Safety didn't come from sleeping under 20 feet of stone. It came from building close, clustering houses together, and surrounding the whole settlement with walls of sharpened logs. Palisades, sometimes 2 or 3 rows thick, rose around villages like wooden teeth, biting the sky. From a distance they looked less like fortresses and more like forests disciplined into vertical ranks. And unlike a stone castle meant to elevate a lord's banner, these defenses belonged to everyone inside. The logic was simple. No single family was more important than the next, so no one got a private tower to themselves. Protection was communal, and so was risk. If raiders came, they didn't find peasants outside the walls scrambling while nobles locked the gates. They found an entire village packed tight within its barricade. The longhouses lined up behind those palisades like ribs within a chest, the whole village itself becoming the defensive organism. Entry was controlled through narrow gates that could be sealed with heavy logs. Watch platforms were sometimes added, allowing a few sharp eyes to peer out over the surrounding fields. Attackers faced not the lonely stone silhouette of a lord's fortress, but a bristling wall of wood concealing dozens of families ready to fight for each other. No banners, no coats of arms, just collective survival. This wasn't theoretical. Warfare between neighboring groups was a regular part of life in the woodlands, whether to avenge deaths, capture prisoners, or assert territory. Raiding parties could strike quickly and vanish just as fast. A palisaded village turned that speed against them. Attacks met coordinated defense, with warriors emerging from gates or lobbing arrows from behind walls. The structure itself gave people time to gather, to push back, to protect their food stores and families. Stone walls in Europe were statements of dominance. Wooden walls here were statements of solidarity. Everyone lived behind them. Everyone depended on them. There wasn't a hierarchy of safety. There wasn't a drawbridge pulled up to let peasants fend for themselves, while nobles feasted. There was a recognition that survival only worked if it was shared. And because palisades were built from the same trees that framed the longhouses, they carried the same principle. They were temporary, but renewable. If fire or weather damaged them, new logs could be cut and lashed into place. If the village moved, a new palisade would rise just as quickly. The fence wasn't locked in immovable stone. It traveled with the people, rebuilt wherever the soil and forest welcomed them. Protection, then, wasn't just military. It was economic, political, and cultural all at once. The palisade wasn't keeping treasures safe for a king. It was keeping the grain, the hearths, and the children safe for the clan. And what was stored inside, stacked on lofts above the fires and tucked along sleeping platforms, was as critical to defense as the logs outside. Grain silos made of stone. Forget it. Wealth here wasn't locked away in vaulted chambers or hoarded in a treasury guarded by armored men. It hung right above your head, in baskets and bundles, swinging gently in the smoky rafters of the longhouse. Corn dried in rows, beans tied in braids, squash sliced and preserved. The famous Three Sisters were as much architectural features as they were meals. If you looked up, you didn't see chandeliers, you saw the future, suspended in storage. Every longhouse doubled as a granary. The rafters were lofts of survival, stuffed with food, not for one nuclear family, but for dozens of related households. Castles stored wealth for lords. Longhouses stored calories for communities. That storage wasn't abstract. It was a daily reminder that your meal wasn't just your meal. Your kin's survival hung overhead, and so did yours. And because food wasn't just sustenance but politics, these stores meant security. Raids weren't just about capturing warriors or asserting dominance. They were about taking or destroying crops. Grain burned in fields could cripple a village. Food hidden in rafters made it through winters. You defended your longhouse not because it was pretty, but because it held the literal embodiment of continuity. The seeds for next year's planting, the dried fish for the lean months, the venison strips that got you through February. Wealth could be measured in the smell of corn husks curing in smoke, in the sound of beans rattling against each other when baskets were shifted. The architecture itself forced you to live under the weight of collective storage. There was no vault door to shut behind a king. Everyone breathed in the same preservation, saw the same surplus hanging over their heads, and understood the same risks if those lofts were ever emptied. And food wasn't the only thing tucked away. Animal pelts, tools, weapons, ceremonial objects, all found space in those elevated platforms. A visitor walking down the long central aisle might read the rafters like a ledger. Which family had harvested plenty, which had traded widely, which had stored carefully. In that sense, the Longhouse was a living account book, visible to all, judged by all. Contrast this with castles, where food supply was hidden, controlled, rationed by stewards at the whim of a lord. In the Longhouse, supply was more transparent, shared, and visible, because the structure itself refused secrecy. You couldn't stockpile quietly without others noticing the sagging beams above your section. The architecture made greed difficult and generosity obvious. This storage system turned survival into something communal. Each loft of beans overhead wasn't just calories, it was kinship turned tangible. Which is why councils, debates, and decisions unfolded under the same roof. When you sat in a Longhouse meeting, you didn't just hear voices. You sat beneath the physical weight of the future, every word colored by what was stored overhead. Those discussions weren't trivial. They were political, confederate, even diplomatic. The Longhouse didn't just feed people, it hosted their negotiations about how to live together. Beneath the rafters stacked with food, another kind of weight pressed down. Decision-making, the same structure that kept people fed, also gathered them into political dialogue. Clan leaders sat in the central aisle, surrounded by the steady glow of hearths, while families leaned close to listen. There was no throne, no elevated chair draped in velvet. Authority didn't tower above it, sat across from you, level with your own fire. Discussions covered everything from the daily when to move fields, how to distribute stored corn, to the monumental-like questions of war, peace, and confederacy agreements. Voices didn't echo off stone walls in solitary halls. They mingled with the hiss of firewood and the shuffle of children being hushed nearby. In that atmosphere, politics wasn't distant. It was intimate, smoky, and impossible to ignore. Leadership itself operated differently here. Men might have carried titles as chiefs, but women shaped those titles with the power to appoint and remove them. Clan mothers could end a leader's authority as swiftly as they had granted it. If his words grew arrogant or unwise, if he stirred conflict rather than healing it, the matrilineal council could strip him of status. That wasn't symbolic, it was binding. No stone fortress in Europe allowed women to pull a crown off a man's head quite so directly. And councils didn't stop at the household. Confederacy meetings, especially among the Haudenosaunee, extended this model outward. Representatives from multiple nations met together in larger gatherings, describing their alliance as living in one long house, a metaphor that mirrored their architecture. Imagine Europe's castles trying to create peace treaties with the phrase, "We're all sharing one dungeon." It would have fallen flat. But here, the very shape of home carried into the vocabulary of politics. Rituals wove through these discussions too. Decisions weren't just practical. They were framed with ceremony, marked by wampum belts that recorded agreements and validated memory. Politics wasn't hidden behind castle doors. It unfolded in the shared spaces where everyone ate, slept, and argued. And the architecture insisted on that openness. You couldn't separate the fires of daily life from the fires of council. Of course, consensus wasn't easy. Imagine 30 families under one roof, each with their own needs, complaints, and ambitions, trying to find common ground while smoke drifted through the rafters and stew simmered nearby. But that was the point. Governance wasn't supposed to be comfortable. It was supposed to be accountable, visible, and tied to the very people whose lives it shaped. In this sense, the house was a parliament as much as it was a home. Decisions were lived as much as they were spoken. The The building itself reminded every leader, every clan mother, every family member that their politics rested on shared fires, shared food, and shared survival. And survival, in this world, wasn't just physical. It carried a spiritual dimension, layered into the very beams and hearths. The architecture wasn't only political, it was cosmological. Step inside, and it wasn't just wood, bark, and smoke that you were entering. The very shape carried a cosmology. The roof was often described as the sky arching above, the floor as the earth beneath, and the fires aligned down the center as stars set into motion. To live there was to live inside a scaled-down version of the universe, where every act of cooking, storytelling, or council meeting folded into a larger order. Hearths were sacred spaces as much as practical ones. Families tended their flames with care, not only for warmth and food, but as a link to the unseen. Fire was alive, a mediator between human beings and the world of spirits. Feeding the flames wasn't just about fuel, it was about respect, about acknowledging that survival was always a shared contract between people, nature, and powers beyond. Ceremonies often unfolded within those bar-covered walls. Songs rose with the smoke, carrying prayers through the roof openings into the sky. Ritual cycles, harvest feasts, condolence ceremonies, renewal rites filled the same spaces where daily life played out. There wasn't a division between sacred and ordinary. The sacred was woven into every step taken on the dirt floor, every log burned, every word spoken in the dim glow of the hearths. Even the building's communal shape was infused with meaning. Its length mirrored kinship stretched across generations, while its arching ribs embodied shelter provided by ancestral strength. The structure wasn't just shelter, it was ancestor and cosmos, both protector and teacher. Contrast this with European castles, where chapels were cordoned off, holiness tucked behind thick stone walls, and officiated by a separate class of clergy. Here, religion wasn't confined to a side wing, it was inseparable from everyday life. The same rafters that dried beans also absorbed chants. The same fires that boiled squash also hosted offerings. Sacredness wasn't elsewhere, it was exactly where you were. And this sense of living inside a universe didn't vanish with daily chores. It pressed into memory, shaping how people thought about time and belonging. A house wasn't just for walls, it was continuity made tangible. To wake under its roof was to be reminded every day that existence wasn't solitary, but communal and cosmic at once. This spiritual weight also gave resilience. When crops failed or enemies threatened, the house still stood as a symbol of balance. To walk its central aisle was to be reminded that the earth still supported you, the sky still sheltered you, and the fires still bound you to forces greater than any one person. Of course, sacredness didn't erase the practical challenges of life. Seasons changed, soils wore out, storms battered walls. When that happened, communities didn't cling to permanence. They moved, dismantling the old, raising the new, carrying memory into fresh frames of wood and bark. Flexibility was itself a kind of faith, the belief that survival came not from holding still, but from adapting with the land. And that mobility, the ability to abandon one set of ribs and raise another somewhere else, wasn't a weakness. It was a strength, woven deep into the design. Nothing about these structures was meant to last forever, and that was the genius. They were never monuments chained to a single patch of earth. They were shelters tuned to the rhythm of soil and season. Fields grew tired after decades of planting corn, beans, and squash. The game thinned, and the firewood disappeared. When the land signaled it was time to move, people didn't mourn. They dismantled, abandoned, and rebuilt elsewhere. Permanence wasn't the goal, renewal was. It's hard to overstate how radical that looks compared to Europe's obsession with castles. Stone fortresses locked their owners into geography. They were both protection and prison. Villages around them could starve, but the Lord's keep would sit immovable, daring the land to change without it. In the northeast woodlands, people didn't pick a fight with their environment, they moved with it. A longhouse might stand 20 years, maybe more, then collapse gracefully, its bark skin and wooden ribs folding back into the forest. The cycle wasn't a failure, it was designed. The mobility was collective. A family couldn't just slip away quietly. The house was too vast, too shared. Relocation was a village event. Entire communities shifted together, carrying seeds, tools, stories, and kinship. Abandoned frames stood as skeletal reminders in the old clearings, slowly reclaimed by moss and saplings. To European eyes, this might have looked like impermanence, even poverty. To those who lived it, it was resilience, never clinging so hard to a building that you forgot the earth beneath it. Practicality shaped the design. Lightweight poles could be harvested and bent quickly, elm bark peeled in large panels to cover the new frames. Women and men worked side by side, children running between the poles as they learned how to fit bark into place. Weeks of effort, not decades, produced a dwelling that could host dozens of families. Compare that to quarrying stone, dragging it with oxen, shaping it with chisels, feeding masons for years, only to end up with walls you could never move. And mobility wasn't just about ecology, it was also about politics. Villages positioned themselves strategically, sometimes relocating to defend territory, sometimes moving closer to trade routes. A castle advertised its location forever, a stone target that couldn't pick itself up and walk away. These houses could. They were not monuments, they were instruments, flexible, adaptive, alive. That adaptability also shaped identity. People didn't define themselves by a building rooted in place, but by kinship and community that traveled with them. Home was less about fixed walls and more about the people you shared fires with. The architecture reinforced it, easy to rebuild, impossible to individualize. Flexibility didn't mean fragility, it meant confidence in the cycle. To abandon one house wasn't to lose home. It was to trust that home could be raised again, wherever the forest allowed. But even while villages could move, life inside the structures pulsed with constancy. Daily rhythms unfolded under those bark ribs, routines repeated around the firelight, generation after generation, and the hum of that routine, the work, the sleep, the meals, gave the scale of everyday life its meaning. Inside those bark-covered ribs, life was relentless, noisy, and deeply communal. Imagine a central aisle running the length of the structure, with fires lined in neat sequence. Along the sides, raised platforms stretched like wooden shelves, each layered with woven mats, furs, and blankets. That's where families slept, cooked, stored tools, and whispered gossip. Above those shelves, lofts groaned under the weight of dried corn and squash, rattling beans, and bundles of pelts. Every inch of space was spoken for. The air was thick with sound. Infants wailing, elders coughing, dogs scuffling, pots clanging, voices rising and colliding over the crackle of fire. Privacy was a fantasy. A thin reed mat hung for modesty, maybe, but sound carried like smoke. If your uncle snored, the whole row knew it. If someone argued about who burned the stew, it became a performance for half the house. Castles might have had their intrigues behind stone doors. Here, nothing was ever hidden. Meals defined the rhythm of the day. Food wasn't prepared in some distant kitchen and carried in on platters. It was cooked right there, at the hearths, with everyone watching. You couldn't bluff your way through culinary failure. If you scorched the venison, the smoke would tell on you. Yet food was also shared, exchanged, passed around. You tasted your neighbor's stew as easily as you smelled it. Craft and work filled the gaps between meals. Women wove mats and baskets, stitched clothing, tended to children. Men carved tools, repaired weapons, shaped canoes. Older children fetched wood, water, and supplies, while younger ones learned by imitating adults, playing at the same skills they would eventually master. And through it all, storytelling wound its way into the smoke. Elders taught not in classrooms, but beside hearths, their voices rising with sparks. Even leisure was collective. Games of chance, songs and dances unfolded in the shared aisle. Board games like deer knuckles clattered against the ground, laughter spilling into every corner. Castles held feasts in grand halls to display wealth and status. Here, the play wasn't about spectacle. It was woven into the same space where life already unfolded. What strikes hardest is how the structure enforced togetherness. You couldn't retreat to a private chamber or sulk in a secluded garden. Living shoulder to shoulder with dozens of relatives meant constant negotiation, patience, compromise, humor. The house trained you to coexist, to endure smoke and noise, to see your own life as inseparable from the lives across the aisle. That closeness created tension. Of course, arguments weren't rare. Rivalries between families flared, but even conflict carried the reminder. Everyone still slept under the same roof. Everyone still depended on the same stored food above their heads. Everyone still kept watch on the same palisade outside. Whatever bitterness brewed at one hearth had to dissolve into cooperation by the next morning, because survival demanded it. Daily life, then, was never just routine. It was practice in cooperation, in resilience, in living as part of something larger. And when compared to the isolation of castles, this way of life made survival a collective act rather than an individual boast. That contrast becomes even sharper when you put the two side by side. Stone fortresses built for hierarchy versus wooden spines built for kinship. Set one of these bark and elm structures beside a medieval stone fortress, and the differences scream louder than any herald's trumpet. Castles rose vertically, stabbing into the skyline with towers and turrets designed to intimidate. The northeastern houses stretched horizontally, long and low, blending into the forest. One said, "Look at me, tremble at my height." The other said, "Come inside, here's where we live together." Stone walls in Europe were monuments to hierarchy. Thick, cold, and unforgiving, they separated ruler from rule. A noble family dined upstairs in drafty grandeur, while peasants huddled in outer huts. Meanwhile, wooden frames in the woodlands dissolved that division. Dozens of families, all tied through maternal lines, lived under the same roof. Authority wasn't elevated to a tower, but woven into the same aisle where everyone else cooked, argued, and raised children. Castles demanded permanence at absurd cost. Quarries torn open, forests stripped. Generations of labor sunk into a wall that might outlast its lord, but not the misery it took to build. In the northeast, houses were built in weeks, raised by the same hands that lived in them, meant to last as long as the land could support them. When the soil failed, the structure was abandoned gracefully, returning to earth. Try moving a castle when the fields are exhausted. You'd sooner break your back than your fealty. Climate only sharpened the contrast. A damp, icy draft in a stone hall was the privilege of power in Europe. Stone absorbed cold, echoing with every footstep, amplifying loneliness. Bark and wood, though smoky, bent to the season. Mats and hides warmed walls. Roof flaps shifted with the wind. Even discomfort felt shared, not isolated. Religion, too, revealed the difference. Castles tucked sacredness into chapels, sealed by priests, separate from the daily grime of kitchens and stables. The northeastern house folded the sacred into its rafters. Fires doubled as both stove and altar. Ceremonies rose from the same flames that cooked supper. Sacredness wasn't hidden behind stained glass. It hovered in the smoke between your aunt's stew and your grandmother's chant. Even defense reflected the divergence. Castles bristled with battlements designed to protect a lineage at the expense of everyone outside. Palisaded villages, by contrast, sheltered all. No lord's gate slammed shut while peasants screamed beyond. If the sharpened logs failed, they failed for everyone inside. And politics in a castle, decrees echoed downward, one man's will cast over thousands. Inside the wooden halls of the northeast, councils argued until consensus crept like fire through bark. Women chose leaders, men advised, but everyone lived with the decisions under the same smoky ceiling. So while Europe's castles became the skeletal ruins tourists climb today, these wooden dwellings mostly rotted back into the earth. One path left monuments of domination, the other left a memory of kinship. And that memory still lingers, because what stone tried to freeze, bark let breathe. It's why, even now, those structures remain symbols, not of wealth or isolation, but of unity. And that unity, smoke-stung, crowded, imperfect, became a legacy strong enough to survive long after the wood had decayed. When the last sheets of elm bark had rotted back into the soil, and the blackened ribs of cedar finally toppled, what remained was never rubble. It was a memory. Memory of fires that had burned for generations. Memory of voices layered like soot in the rafters. Memory of councils that turned architecture into politics. Unlike castles, which haunt Europe as crumbling skeletons of stone, these houses haunt in another way, as living ideas carried forward long after the wood was gone. Among the Haudenosaunee, the structure itself became more than shelter. It was a metaphor. Confederacy leaders spoke of living together in one long house, the roof arching from east to west, each nation a hearth along its aisle. Unity wasn't carved into a monument. It was envisioned as a dwelling. The architecture outlasted the material. Even when the buildings decayed, the model of coexistence remained, encoded into diplomacy and law. Today, the form still holds ceremonial weight. In gatherings, the concept of the longhouse is evoked not as nostalgia, but as continuity. It stands as a symbol of belonging, of kinship tied through maternal lines, of councils that worked toward consensus rather than decree. Castles became backdrops for tourist selfies. Bark and smoke became frameworks for a living tradition. The contrast with Europe is almost absurd. Visitors flocked to stare at the cracked battlements of kings who taxed peasants into starvation just to raise another tower. Meanwhile, the memory of these wooden dwellings lives on in political models that influenced democratic thought, in the persistence of clan systems, in stories where architecture was less about intimidation and more about endurance through cooperation. There's also something quietly eerie in the absence of ruins. You can still touch castle walls, climb their stairs, feel the chill of their dungeons. But these houses left no skeletons for posterity. They vanish into the soil, absorbed by the same forest that gave them life. What survives is not stone but story, and in that sense, they remain truer monuments than any crumbling fortress. Think of what permanence really means. Castles stood, but their systems fractured. The wooden ribs decayed, but the worldview community over hierarchy, adaptability over domination, balance over isolation, endured. A house of bark and smoke, fragile as it seemed, carried forward values strong enough to outlive the most arrogant stone. And so their legacy isn't architectural in the conventional sense. It's symbolic, spiritual, political. Every retelling of their design, every invocation in council, every ceremonial use keeps the structure alive, even if no beam remains. Permanence, it turns out, doesn't need stone. Sometimes it needs nothing more than memory breathed into words, stories passed like fire from hearth to hearth. That's why when people still speak of them, they don't talk about ruins or rubble. They talk about a way of living together, under one roof, with all the smoke, noise, laughter, and conflict that implies. And maybe that's the truest monument, not a wall that survives the centuries, but an idea that refuses to collapse. It began with a forest, not a blueprint. A group of women and men stood among straight trunks of elm and cedar, gauging which trees bent best without splintering. No one drew plans. They already knew how long the house would be because they knew how many families it would hold. Knowledge measured not in feet or cubits, but in relationships. The trees were cut, stripped, and softened in steam. When bent into arcs and lashed together, they made a ribcage large enough to swallow several generations at once. The shape was deliberate, curved enough to shrug off snow, tall enough to let smoke rise, narrow enough to stay warm. Its skin was bark, peeled in great sheets that still smelled of sap. These sheets overlapped like scales, turning the walls into a kind of living armor against rain. Inside, a long corridor stretched forward, lined with hearths. Sleeping platforms rose along the edges, each one belonging to a pair of families. Nothing in the structure suggested ownership. There were no doors to shut, no rooms to hoard. You belonged to the house as much as it belonged to you. The building grew from the center outward, like a living organism adapting to its occupants. When a new marriage joined the clan or another generation was born, more ribs could be added, more bark peeled, another hearth dug. The structure lengthened, accommodating life the way a river accommodates its banks. It didn't stand to impress. It stood to contain. There's a quiet humility in that, an understanding that architecture should serve the breath of human life, not petrify it. Every curve of wood and bark had its reason. The arched ceiling trapped warmth, the narrow width forced proximity, and the central aisle served as both artery and gathering ground. Even the smoke, that ever-present haze clinging to beams, wasn't an inconvenience but an ingredient. It preserved meat, hardened wood, and drove away insects. The place smelled of sap, ash, and stew. It wasn't pleasant, but it was honest. Outside, the shape of the house blended with the forest that birthed it. Nothing about it shouted permanence. In a few decades, the bark would curl and blacken, the poles would soften, and the earth would reclaim it. But for those years in between, it would pulse with life. The structure's endurance came not from its materials, but from the continuity of people who built, abandoned, and rebuilt it in rhythm with the land. Its proportions were oddly human, long like a spine, curved like a ribcage, filled with breath and heat. If a castle was a fossilized expression of dominance, this was anatomy-made architecture. Every line was practical, but every practical line was also social. The design enforced cooperation before the first fire was lit. You couldn't walk from one end to the other without acknowledging the dozens of lives between. You couldn't hoard space without someone noticing. When the last bark sheet was tied and the smoke from the first hearth curled into the roof, the building didn't simply exist, it exhaled. It became a framework for everything that followed: cooking, sleeping, argument, affection. A single roof stretched across dozens of lives, holding them in uneasy, necessary intimacy. And as the first night fell, embers glowed along the aisle like vertebrae, connecting one end of the house to the other. The fires would keep burning, steady, stubborn, and shared, turning structure into organism, architecture into atmosphere. Down the long corridor, a sequence of fires flickered like vertebrae in a living spine. Each hearth served two families, though it rarely stopped there. Heat, light, and conversation ignored boundaries. Flames reached upward, twisting into the dark rafters where smoke collected before escaping through flaps in the roof. It never fully left. Instead, it lingered in slow layers, staining the beams black, thickening the air until even silence seemed smoky. Every inhale carried the memory of meals, births, and quarrels long cooled to ash. The hearth wasn't merely functional, it was the clock, the altar, and the parliament of the household. Around it, days began and ended, food dried above it, tools hardened beside it, and stories spiraled through its light. Even conflict softened in its presence. When arguments flared, they were folded into the rhythm of stirring pots or feeding embers. The fire demanded attention, and in giving it, tempers cooled. Children learned early which fire was theirs. They fetched wood, fed twigs, and knew never to cross the invisible boundaries of another family's flame. Still, heat traveled. It made borders meaningless. In a house hundreds of feet long, warmth spread unevenly, strongest in the middle, faint near the walls. That gradient of temperature mirrored the social one. Those near the center carried more responsibility, more guests, more gossip. Each hearth had its own choreography. Women leaned over clay pots, stirring stews thick with corn and beans. Men sat repairing tools or carving handles. Children drifted in and out, drawn to the hypnotic dance of light. Sparks escaped upward, small rebellions that left their mark as pinpricks on the bark ceiling. And yet, despite all that fire, the place rarely burned. Smoke, for all its nuisance, kept the walls damp and safe. The house had learned to live with its own danger. When winter deepened, the hearth became the axis of existence. People slept close to its glow, turning through the night like spokes around a wheel. The light was never fully extinguished. Someone was always tending it, stirring coals, breathing warmth back into reluctant embers. The line between domestic care and ritual blurred. Feeding a fire was feeding the house itself. There's something quietly absurd about it. Dozens of families cohabiting under one smoky roof, trusting the same line of fires not to suffocate them. Yet that absurdity worked. The system endured because it was shared. No single flame belonged to one person any more than the air did. Ownership was replaced by stewardship. You maintained the fire, and in return, it maintained you. Every flicker reflected a pulse of the larger body. The longhouse breathed through its smoke holes. Its temperature rose and fell like breath. Its people moved in patterns shaped by the glow. You could track the social life of the community just by watching the flames, where laughter gathered, where silence thickened, where warmth waned. And as the last embers of the evening faded into the dark, the house exhaled once more, holding the heat inside like a memory. Each fire dimmed but didn't die, lying low under ash until morning. The night belonged to the soft hiss of coals, the occasional murmur of someone turning in their sleep, and the constant slow drift of smoke through the ribs of the roof. In that dim half-light, the structure was no longer just shelter, it was a single organism, breathing, murmuring, alive. And within its glow, patterns of kinship quietly arranged themselves, shaping not just who slept where, but who belonged to whom. Order lived in the architecture. The long corridor wasn't just a hallway, it was a map of bloodlines. Space followed ancestry more faithfully than any written record. Families belonging to the same maternal line occupied the same section, each pair sharing a hearth. At the far end, older generations held the most stable ground, the literal and symbolic core of the house. Younger couples branched outward like new shoots on an old root, their bark walls thinner, their status still flexible. There was no front door in the sense of ownership, no grand entrance leading to hierarchy. You entered from one end, greeted whichever relative was closest, and immediately became part of the rhythm inside. Positioning mattered, not for prestige, but for balance. The entire structure functioned like a living kinship diagram. Every sleeping platform, every hearth, every path from fire to fire mirrored the clan's genealogy. Matrilineal ties bound it all. Descent moved through the mother's side, not the father's. So your identity followed the line of those who raised, fed, and stored your memory. Men married in quietly absorbed into their wives' section of the house. Their authority was limited to courtesy, their presence provisional. If a marriage soured, a man might simply return to his mother's house, his spot replaced before his sleeping mat cooled. The system wasn't cruel, it was practical. Continuity belonged to women, and stability came from those who never left. This arrangement also carried an unspoken diplomacy. Living among so many relatives meant understanding proximity as a form of communication. Sleeping closer to the center implied trust and seniority. Sleeping toward the edges signaled newer ties. Even movement through the corridor had etiquette. Passing another hearth required acknowledgement, a glance, a word, or at least a shift of the eyes. To ignore someone in that confined space was a small social crime, the kind that simmered and spread faster than smoke. Each section developed its own micro-rhythm, separate pots, conversations, even distinct smells. And yet boundaries were more porous than walls suggested. Children drifted between sections, gathering where food smelled better or stories were livelier. Elders traveled less, but their influence stretched furthest. Their words could cross hearth lines, like wind through bark seams, unseen but felt. The result was a society built on constant, low-level negotiation. You couldn't isolate yourself without breaking the system. Silence could offend, generosity could bind, and gossip, that most human of lubricants, kept everything running. Everyone knew everyone's business, which meant everyone's business mattered. Privacy wasn't absent, it was collective. The community held your secrets like it held your smoke, suspended in the air, belonging to everyone a little. It's easy to romanticize this arrangement, to imagine a harmony of extended family under a common roof. But the truth was more complex. There were alliances, tensions, subtle power plays acted out in seating arrangements, and shared meals. Space was political, and the architecture didn't just reflect that reality, it enforced it. The corridor's length was the measure of kinship itself, long enough to contain both cooperation and conflict, narrow enough that no one could escape either for long. Every hearth was a negotiation table, every sleeping platform a truce, and as dawn filtered through the smoke holes and glowed along the bark walls, the structure revealed what it really was, not merely a home, but a map of lineage embodied in wood. That map dictated everything: who cooked where, who inherited what, who spoke first, and who listened. It was a living order, fragile but enduring, as binding as the fibers that tied the ribs of the house together. Somewhere between that structure and the people inside it, a rhythm of work began to pulse: shared labor, shared noise, shared survival. Morning didn't arrive quietly, it hissed. The fires, banked low through the night, woke first a few careful breaths, a twist of dry bark, and then the crackle of light returned. Smoke slid lazily along the ceiling before finding its way out. Someone coughed. Someone else stirred the ashes with a stick. Within minutes, the entire house began to move like a body coming back to life. Tasks fell into rhythm as naturally as heartbeat. Women checked the storage lofts, untying bundles of corn, shaking dust from baskets. Men reached for tools, bone scrapers, stone blades, fishing gear laid out beside their sleeping platforms. Children fetched water, or simply got underfoot, which was also part of the system. Every sound belonged: the grind of pestles in mortar, the dull thump of wood on wood, the muffled laughter at some half-remembered dream. Work wasn't divided by rigid command, but by instinct and habit. The same hands that cooked might later weave mats or mend clothing. Cooperation wasn't a virtue, it was survival. With dozens of fires and mouths under one roof, disorder could turn a normal day into chaos. Yet there was an invisible choreography to it all. People shifted in narrow spaces without collisions. Conversations passed seamlessly from one hearth to the next, and even arguments had their place in the day's rhythm. The house carried its own acoustics, scraping, murmuring, soft footfalls on packed earth. From outside, it might have sounded like a forest murmuring in its sleep. From inside, it felt like continuity, labor threaded through the walls themselves. The design demanded awareness. You couldn't hammer, stir, or carve without considering the people within earshot, and everyone was within earshot. Over time, that awareness became second nature, a quiet courtesy embedded in every gesture. Meals emerged in slow waves. Someone roasted fish, another stirred stew thickened with beans and corn. The smell reached down the corridor like a summons, wrapping the house in a scent equal parts comfort and endurance. Food was both daily necessity and subtle diplomacy. A bowl shared could ease an argument. A withheld portion could start one. Between chores, there were moments that barely looked like rest but counted as it. Leaning against the wall, combing hair near the firelight, teaching a child how to grind corn without scattering half of it across the floor. Elders offered commentary, half advice, half sarcasm, from their spots near the central hearth. Their voices were less commands than reminders, echoes of routines that had been followed for generations. As daylight filtered through the roof flaps, people drifted in and out of the doorway, into the village beyond. The long interior emptied and filled again in pulses, like breathing. Hunters left in small groups. Others walked to nearby fields where rows of corn bent in the wind. Those who stayed kept fires alive, fed animals, repaired tools, or traded stories with the steady patience of people who knew time wasn't to be fought but filled. Every action depended on shared timing. When to light fires, when to cook, when to sleep. Solitude was rare, so silence became its substitute. People learned to work together in quiet efficiency, speaking only when needed. The architecture itself encouraged it. Too much noise, and the walls seemed to vibrate with complaint. Too little, and the house felt uneasy, as if waiting for life to return. By evening, the cycle reversed. Fires grew brighter, smoke thickened, and fatigue softened the air. Work done, the sound shifted from clatter to conversation, from industry to intimacy. And somewhere in that smoky dimness, with dozens of fires flickering in imperfect unison, you could sense the unspoken truth of the place, that life wasn't divided between labor and rest, but woven between them, an unending negotiation between necessity and harmony. The rhythm didn't stop for sleep, it simply changed tempo, and with nightfall came its own rituals, silence, patience, and the constant testing of how close to close could be. Privacy was a polite fiction, like a story everyone agreed to believe in but no one could quite prove. There were no walls, only partitions of woven reeds or hanging furs, thin enough that a whispered argument about burnt stew might drift 3 hearths down before breakfast. Every cough, every sigh, every badly tuned lullaby belonged to everyone within earshot. Living together meant being witnessed constantly, inconveniently, and without escape. The unwritten rule was simple: pretend not to hear. When two lovers quarreled, the rest of the house learned to hum softly, to stir a pot louder than necessary, to develop sudden fascination with their own fingernails. Discretion wasn't about secrecy, it was about manners, and manners were survival. In a house packed with dozens of relatives, diplomacy began long before the council fire. Tension didn't vanish, it fermented. Someone's firewood mysteriously vanished. Someone else's stew pot went unreturned, and suddenly the air felt thick, even without the smoke. But confrontation was rare. Anger in close quarters was dangerous. It had nowhere to go. So people cultivated subtler weapons, teasing that cut just enough to sting. Silence that spoke louder than shouting. Generosity that carried the faint scent of debt. When all else failed, elders stepped in, not with punishment, but with humor. An old woman might tell a parable about a foolish hunter who forgot how to share, her voice rising just enough for the guilty party to blush. No names mentioned, no accusations made, but everyone understood. Conflict resolution came with laughter, uncomfortable, necessary, disarming. And if irritation built too high, there were still outlets. Some retreated outside, to the fields or riverbank, under the pretext of fetching water. Others found solace in chores, pounding corn with unnecessary enthusiasm until the rhythm of labor smoothed the edges of resentment. Anger wasn't repressed, it was recycled. Personal space existed only as gesture. A mat drawn closed meant not now. Averted eyes during dressing or sleep meant respect offered, respect expected. Yet, inevitably, boundaries blurred. Children stumbled into the wrong corner, dogs wandered between families, and the line between mine and ours dissolved daily. The absence of privacy bred a different kind of awareness, not self-centeredness, but self-control. Even affection had to adapt. There was tenderness, yes, but muted, folded into shared labor. A hand steadying another's while grinding corn. A quiet exchange of food before a long day. A moment's laughter that dissolved tension more effectively than apology. Love, irritation, loyalty, all compressed under the same bark roof until they became indistinguishable from one another. Visitors often remarked on the calm inside, the way a house full of life could seem almost hushed. It wasn't peace exactly, more like equilibrium, a collective agreement that noise could become violence if allowed too much room. Speech was measured, glances careful. In that balance, something remarkable happened. Restraint became culture. But even with restraint, the architecture still pressed people close enough to feel every emotional draft. Every joy and frustration bounced off the same beams, traveled the same air. The house remembered. And so, within those smoky corridors, etiquette was more than courtesy. It was architecture made social. People learned to live without walls by building them inside themselves. Still, not all authority was quiet. There were figures whose words carried more weight than the rest. Those who decided when patience ended and order began to fray. Their influence radiated not from command but from endurance, and it usually came wrapped in gray hair and the smell of dried corn. If the house had a pulse, women kept it steady. Their authority wasn't loud, but it was absolute, as constant as the smoke, and twice as necessary. The structure itself reflected it. Lineage flowed through mothers, not fathers. The hearth, the food, the very right to occupy space inside, all inherited through the maternal line. Men might build the frames, but women owned the walls. Each matron governed her section like a quiet monarch of bark and fire. Her domain wasn't marked by boundary stones or flags, but by baskets of corn, hanging gourds, and the knowledge of exactly how much food could feed her kin until spring. Leadership meant memory, remembering who was hungry, who was grieving, who needed silence more than advice. In a place without locks or keys, order relied on her mind. The central storage lofts were her treasury. Dried corn and beans stacked in woven sacks, smoked meat hanging from the rafters. This was wealth measured in calories, not currency. Distribution followed no written law, only fairness as practiced over generations. To give too freely risked waste, to hoard invited resentment. Balance was everything, and balance, inconveniently, always required the judgment of women. Disputes between families often landed at a matron's feet, though she rarely raised her voice. Instead, she sat by the fire, stirring the pot a little longer than needed, and waited. Sooner or later, someone cracked under the weight of her silence and confessed whatever petty grievance had poisoned the air. Her justice was slow, methodical, and laced with humor, sharp enough to sting but not scar. No man in the house wanted to be the subject of her stories the next night. Her authority extended beyond household logistics. When leaders were chosen, it was the elder women who nominated them, sons, nephews, brothers, men entrusted not with power, but with representation. Leadership was loaned, never owned, and could be revoked if misused. The matrilineal system wasn't ideology, it was practical insurance. Men went to war, hunted, or died early. Women stayed, and the line continued through them. You could see this permanence in the way they moved, efficient, deliberate, unbothered by the chaos around them. They carried entire genealogies in their heads, remembering who married whom, who was kin by blood or by obligation, who owed favors and who was due forgiveness. Their authority wasn't written, but everyone read it fluently. Even the physical space bent toward them. The hearth was the center of daily life, and women sat nearest its glow, closest to the tools of sustenance. Men drifted in and out, but the women remained keepers of continuity, interpreters of fire, archivists of habit. The smell of their work was the smell of the house itself, corn, wood smoke and ash. It wasn't all reverence, of course. Power attracts frustration, and men grumbled in the way men always have, quietly, when out of earshot. But the order held, because the alternative was chaos. A longhouse without its women was like a hearth without fire, possible in theory, disastrous in practice. Their governance was invisible to outsiders precisely because it was total. No titles, no crowns, no written laws, only the steady choreography of competence. And competence rarely advertises itself, it just endures. From that endurance came teaching. Every motion, stirring, weaving, negotiating, doubled as instruction for the next generation. Young girls absorbed power without ceremony, learning not from lectures but from proximity. Authority was hereditary by osmosis. And from those small acts, tending fires, distributing food, diffusing quarrels, women held the rhythm of life itself. That rhythm pulsed through generations, feeding the continuity that made this communal existence not merely survivable, but stable. Under their supervision, the house breathed evenly, and within that balance, stories and skills passed seamlessly from one generation to the next, carried not in books or carvings but in gestures repeated beside the same old fire. Knowledge didn't arrive with ceremony, it seeped. It clung to gestures, words half heard beside the fire, the sound of a tool against wood. There were no lessons, only participation. Children learned by orbiting their elders, absorbing skill through proximity. You didn't teach a child to weave, you handed them reeds, let their fingers fumble, and corrected them only when the basket collapsed. You didn't instruct them on when to speak, the walls did that. Noise carried too far, and embarrassment did the rest. Stories were the main school, told not for entertainment but calibration. They taught you when to laugh, when to fall silent, when to notice the space between things. An elder would begin a tale at dusk, voice gravelly, fingers tracing the air as if weaving images out of smoke. The story might be about a hunter, or a ghost, or a foolish ancestor who ignored advice and ended up married to a bear. Everyone knew the story already, but the point was in the telling. Each repetition came with small edits, a moral sharpened, a memory retrieved, a joke added to ease some recent tension. Storytelling was less about past events than about maintaining present harmony. Skills passed the same way. Boys watched men carve bows or shape canoes, memorizing rhythm before technique. Girls watched women cure meat or stitch hides, learning patience before precision. By the time anyone was officially taught, they already knew the choreography by heart. Elders were not instructors so much as oracles of everyday life. Their expertise wasn't abstract, it was tactile. How to read a change in the smoke's direction, how to judge the sound of a pot's bubbling without looking inside, how to sense when a child's silence meant guilt rather than peace. These were small, unteachable instincts, the kind that disappear if you write them down. Memory held everything together, genealogies, harvest cycles, the right chance for a death or a birth, all carried in the body of the community. Forgetting was a kind of social failure, so remembering became sacred work. A well-told story could keep a person alive long after their bones had turned to dust. Knowledge didn't move vertically, from teacher to student, but horizontally, like fire spreading from hearth to hearth. A grandmother's recipe might reach a distant cousin before her own daughter learned it. A child might repeat a joke overheard from another section of the house, reshaping it without realizing they were also carrying culture forward. Transmission wasn't structured, it was viral, contagious, democratic. Even play was pedagogy. Children reenacted adult rituals with bits of bark and feathers, mimicking council meetings or mock marriages. They didn't understand what they were imitating, but imitation was enough. By the time they grew into the roles, the movements were already in their muscles. Culture was learned unconsciously, the most effective way any culture ever survives. Elders guarded this process not by controlling it, but by letting it unfold. Occasionally, one might intervene, a quick correction, a warning disguised as humor, but mostly they watched. Patience was their pedagogy. To rush understanding was to spoil it, and so the longhouse itself became the classroom. Rafters whispering with drying herbs, fires flickering like living metronomes, the scent of smoke threading through every story told. What children learned was less a collection of facts than an orientation how to live among others without breaking the rhythm. That rhythm extended beyond memory and into ritual, where knowledge met faith and daily life touched the edges of the sacred. When the daily rhythm swelled into ceremony, the house transformed. The same fires that simmered stews and dried corn became portals. Ordinary gestures, sweeping ashes, feeding flames were suddenly charged with purpose. Someone would hum a few notes, another would answer, and soon the entire corridor filled with the low murmur of voices aligning like the tuning of an instrument. Ritual wasn't an interruption of life, it was life magnified. The architecture invited it. Aisles became processional paths, hearths turned altars, the roof itself an imitation of the sky. Smoke drifted upward like prayer made visible, carrying words that no one rushed to finish. Every family, every fire, contributed a verse. It wasn't performance, it was continuity. Ceremonies marked everything that required remembering births, deaths, harvests, alliances, even apologies too large for ordinary conversation. The collective gathered because individuality had no place in sacred matters. A person might mourn privately, but grief was always public. Healing required witnesses. At the height of ritual, the house blurred the boundaries between domestic and divine. A child's cry might interrupt a chant. A dog might wander between dancers, and no one minded. The sacred had no separate space. It wove through the everyday like a thread of gold in rough cloth. To Europeans who later observed it, the lack of division seemed irreverent, but to those who lived inside, it was coherence. The most striking ceremonies often took place at night. Firelight flickered against the bark walls, casting hundreds of moving shadows, ancestors, spirits, echoes, take your pick. Drums thudded softly, made from deerskin stretched over hollow wood, each beat sinking heart to fire. The rhythm wasn't urgent, it was hypnotic, almost drowsy, designed not to excite but to align. You could feel the house breathing with the people inside it, exhaling smoke and song together. No ritual belonged to an individual. Even leadership rotated, a speaker here, a singer there. No single figure claiming the moment. Authority dissolved into chorus. And that dissolution was the point. The Longhouse existed to remind its inhabitants that selfhood was a brief condition, easily absorbed into the larger weave. Ceremonies also reinforced alliances far beyond the walls. Visitors from neighboring villages were welcomed, fed, and drawn into the rhythm until distinctions blurred. The shared roof became a symbol of shared humanity, no small feat in a world defined by seasonal scarcity and territorial pressure. The architecture, flexible and inclusive, extended the same hospitality as the ritual itself. Objects held significance only through their use. A gourd, rattle, a carved mask, a string of beads, all sacred in motion, ordinary at rest. Meaning came from participation, not possession. When the songs ended, items were stored beside the baskets of corn, equal in rank. Nothing stayed sacred forever. It didn't need to. By dawn, the fire burned lower, smoke pale and thin, voices hoarse from singing. The ceremony would end without announcement, just a quiet shift back into domestic rhythm. Someone fed the embers, someone checked the drying racks, and the house, the same old smoky, noisy, crowded house, resumed its hum. But something lingered, a faint stillness, a residue of unity that outlasted fatigue. The ceremony had done what it was meant to, reminded everyone that beneath the squabbles and smoke, they were one breath, one body, one roof, and under that same roof, the economy of survival continued, an invisible trade of food, labor, and favor that held the structure together as firmly as its ribs of bent wood. Survival here wasn't about accumulation, it was about circulation. Nothing stayed still, not food, not tools, not obligation. Corn passed from one hearth to another as naturally as gossip. A family that hunted well-shared meat, one that harvested more beans than expected, sent them down the corridor in baskets. Refusal was rare and almost impolite, not because generosity was saintly, but because isolation was dangerous. The economy of the house was built on favors instead of currency, with everyone keeping an invisible ledger that didn't quite balance and wasn't meant to. Debt existed, but it was social rather than numerical. You helped because you'd been helped. You gave because tomorrow you might need. The system worked precisely because no one ever declared it aloud. Work followed the same logic. Roof repair. Everyone with hands helped. Someone's child fell ill. A neighbor fetched herbs while another tended their fire. Reciprocity wasn't a transaction, it was a reflex. Even laziness had its place, tolerated, observed, gently mocked. The truly idle rarely stayed that way long. Public opinion was sharper than any punishment. Food stored above the rafters wasn't private property. Technically, it belonged to the clan. In practice, it belonged to whoever needed it most that season. Senior women oversaw distribution, their judgment treated as final. If you wanted to know who held real power, you didn't look at the warriors. You watched the women who decided when the corn baskets opened. Trade extended beyond walls. Neighbors exchanged furs, shells, tools, and stories with other villages, turning interdependence into diplomacy. Trade routes weren't just economic arteries, they were lifelines of peace. You couldn't raid someone whose cousin married into your longhouse, at least not easily. Shared kinship and shared goods blurred the lines between ours and theirs. Reciprocity also governed emotion. Kindness had currency, and so did restraint. To lose your temper was to bankrupt your reputation. To forgive publicly was to increase your credit. Even humor was a kind of exchange, laughter smoothing over small inequalities before they could grow teeth. It's easy to underestimate the sophistication of such a system. Europeans who first observed it mistook cooperation for Navit, as if generosity were a sign of weakness, but they misunderstood the quiet power in mutual obligation. No one here needed prisons or police. Social survival depended on reputation, and reputation traveled faster than smoke. At night, as fires dimmed and murmurs softened, that invisible network of favors still pulsed beneath the silence. Someone would remember that another had shared food during the last lean winter, and that memory would become tomorrow's generosity. Obligation was warmth that never went out completely. The system had elasticity, bending with hardship and stretching through abundance. Famine didn't fracture it, it deepened it. Cooperation wasn't idealism, it was adaptation. When the forest grew quiet or the fields turned thin, people didn't retreat into self-preservation, they drew closer. The longhouse wasn't built to keep others out, it was built to keep everyone in. And in that closeness, that endless circulation of food, labor, and goodwill, a philosophy emerged. One that valued harmony not as moral virtue but as survival strategy. It wasn't perfection, it was endurance. And endurance, in this house, had a soul of its own, born of smoke, kinship, and the slow patience of people who knew that to live together required not faith, but skill. That skill became the deepest inheritance of all, a worldview carved into gesture and habit. The quiet art of coexistence that outlasted walls, wood, and even time itself. Resilience wasn't a quality anyone named, it was a rhythm everyone lived by. The house itself taught it the way bark warped with rain, how smoke found new paths when the wind changed, how a wall could be mended from within before the damage showed outside. People absorbed that lesson. Flexibility was survival, and endurance came not from hardness but from give. When famine threatened, meals shrank, not tempers. Families tightened their belts, shifted portions, made stew from things that weren't supposed to be stew. When sickness swept through the corridor, the hearths dimmed in turn, but they didn't go out. Each recovery was a communal act. Every bowl of broth a small declaration of defiance. Misfortune was collective, and so was recovery. Hierarchy existed, but only as scaffolding, never as throne. Authority flowed like heat from a fire, strongest nearby, fading with distance, but still shared. You couldn't dictate in a place where everyone heard you sneeze. Leadership here meant persuasion, and persuasion depended on memory. The best leaders weren't the loudest, but the ones who remembered who had helped whom when it mattered. Resilience also lived in migration. When the soil tired, when wood grew scarce, when the forests stopped giving freely, people didn't mourn permanence, they dismantled it. The house came apart, like a body shedding skin, bark peeled, poles removed, the ground left clean. Then it began again somewhere else. Same shape, new life. There was no fear of loss, because loss was built into the system. This mobility was a form of wisdom. Civilizations obsessed with permanence built monuments. Those who understood the land built relationships. The Longhouse, impermanent as it was, outlasted empires precisely because it could disappear. You can't conquer what dissolves willingly. In this way, resilience became philosophy, a worldview rooted in cooperation rather than conquest. To survive together required humility before nature and before one another. The forest provided the house's bones. The community provided its breath. Break either, and everything collapsed. The people who lived this way didn't romanticize balance, they enforced it, daily, through patience and repetition. Even death obeyed the same rhythm. When someone passed, their memory stayed woven into the routines, a story retold, a tool kept, a recipe repeated. The person dissolved into continuity, never entirely gone. The living carried the dead not as burden but as pattern. That continuity was the architecture's true foundation, deeper than cedar poles or bark walls. Resilience wasn't endurance alone. It was the refusal to isolate. If a single family faltered, others absorbed the weight. If misfortune struck one hearth, nearby fires burned a little hotter. This collective elasticity meant that catastrophe rarely fractured them, it reshaped them. The philosophy that emerged was both practical and quietly poetic. The world wasn't meant to be mastered, only lived with. The self wasn't a fortress, the home wasn't a castle, and permanence was an illusion best enjoyed briefly. Harmony wasn't about peace, it was about balance, the kind that smokes your eyes and warms your bones at the same time. And so, within that smoky, crowded, endlessly adaptive world, resilience didn't look heroic. It looked like small acts, another log on the fire, another bowl passed down the line, another wall rebuilt before the rain returned. No monument marked this endurance. The forest reclaimed every trace. But the real legacy lingered in the habits that refused to die, the instinct to rebuild, to share, to listen. The longhouse eventually rotted, its poles softened, its bark peeled back into the soil. Yet the idea that dozens of lives could coexist under one roof without walls, without greed, without collapse, remained. It traveled in stories, in memory, in the very concept of community itself. And that was the quiet triumph. A civilization that didn't need stone to be remembered, because it had already learned how to survive in smoke. The first thing to understand about those houses is that they weren't built for comfort, at least not in the modern sense. They were built for survival. And survival doesn't care much about privacy. The walls were bark, stitched together with roots and softened by smoke. They sighed with every gust of wind. The sound of one person breathing could travel the entire length of the structure, mixing with the crackle of fire and the mutter of sleep. You couldn't whisper without someone knowing who you were whispering about. Inside, there were no doors, no separate chambers, no quiet corners for secrets to grow in. Space wasn't divided by ownership, but by necessity. Families arranged around their hearths, mats rolled out in order, tools hanging above. The architecture admitted everything: noise, laughter, weeping, hunger, and the occasional snore that set off a wave of giggles down the corridor. Privacy was physically impossible, and so, nobody expected it. The idea of solitude would have seemed as strange as locking up air. The house's logic was brutally practical. One roof meant one fire line, and one fire line meant fewer resources burned. The central aisle doubled as kitchen, meeting hall, and theater of human drama. Walls thin enough to leak gossip also leaked heat, which was the entire point. Warmth didn't belong to individuals. It moved communally, settling wherever bodies gathered. The architecture forced cooperation through physics, no philosophy required. It's easy to imagine how suffocating that might feel now, raised as we are on the religion of doors and personal space. But for them, the soundscape of the long dwelling was the sound of safety. Silence meant danger, illness, hunger, or absence. Hum of voices, the hiss of sap in the fire, even the rhythmic cough of an elder near sleep. These were proof that the world still held together. In a way, the walls were thin not because of poor design, but because life demanded permeability. There's something beautifully ironic in how much thought went into creating buildings that pretended not to exist. From the outside, they blended into the forest, low and curved, smoke curling up like ghost breath. From within, they dissolved the notion of inside altogether. The forest pressed its scent through every seam. The people didn't live apart from nature, they lived through it. The architecture didn't separate them from the elements, it moderated their relationship. At night, when the fires burned low, the bark walls glowed faintly orange, as if the entire structure were a sleeping creature, ribs lit from within. You could hear everything: babies fussing, someone rolling over, wood settling in the cold. The house breathed, literally, exhaling smoke, inhaling air through gaps between its seams. If a European traveler had called it primitive, the people inside might have laughed softly at the misunderstanding. Nothing about it was accidental. The openness was deliberate. After all, concealment was a luxury for those who could afford it. In a world where starvation came with the snow and danger with the dark, visibility was insurance. A roof shared by many kept out death more efficiently than a wall that kept out sound. So they built exposure into their survival, and in doing so, erased the line between private and public altogether. It's a peculiar thought that the closer you were to the fire, the more you belonged, and the more eyes watched you live. But here, that was how life worked. A web of observation and mutual dependence stretched beneath a single smoky roof, and through that web, something else emerged, an economy of seeing and being seen, where visibility wasn't intrusion but trust, and secrecy carried more risk than comfort. Everything inside that roof was public property, or close enough, not by decree, but by design. When food was stored in woven baskets above the rafters, everyone could see exactly how much was left. A family with plenty couldn't pretend to be starving, and one with nothing didn't have to beg. Transparency replaced currency. It wasn't generosity that kept the system afloat, it was visibility. You couldn't hoard what everyone could count. Even the fires betrayed you. A strong, bright flame meant full bellies. A weak, hesitant one whispered scarcity. Every ember told a story about who had hunted well, who had been lazy, who had lost a child. People didn't need ledgers, they read the signs in smoke. The communal structure turned economics into choreography. If one family roasted fish, someone else brought squash, another shared corn. Everyone owed everyone else, constantly, in small, unspoken ways. Debt wasn't shameful. It was proof of participation. The most pitied person wasn't the one in need, but the one excluded from the exchange, the silent corner, the hearth no one visited. Invisibility was poverty. This arrangement sounds idyllic to the modern mind until you realize how little room it left for ego. There was no version of mind that lasted beyond the next meal. What you made was watched. What you ate was shared. And if you took more than your share, gossip burned faster than firewood. The same thin walls that kept the cold out also kept everyone honest. Ownership had a shorter lifespan than smoke. A pot was yours until your cousin borrowed it. A knife until someone needed it more. Even the concept of waste didn't exist. Leftover broth became tomorrow's stew. Scraps became tools. Tools became offerings. Every object carried the fingerprints of a dozen people. Every meal the taste of a dozen hands. In that constant circulation, wealth became indistinguishable from responsibility. Visibility also managed power. No leader could eat privately, make alliances behind doors, or whisper conspiracies out of earshot. Authority here wasn't sealed off in chambers or guarded by silence. It was observed, discussed, and corrected in real time. The watchfulness of the community was its first law. What seems like vulnerability, living without privacy, without barriers, was actually control. Transparency protected the weak more than any wall could. If a man struck his wife, others saw it. If a hunter returned with nothing, others helped. Mutual observation bred accountability long before anyone invented courts. Everyone was both witness and defendant, judge and neighbor. Of course, this kind of honesty could suffocate. Every misstep was noticed, every failure public, but even shame had a use. It kept people woven tightly, dependent on forgiveness as much as food. A mistake wasn't the end of reputation, it was an opportunity for restoration, made possible only because everyone had seen you fall. In such a world, secrecy became dangerous. Hidden motives hinted at betrayal. Silence smelled of deceit. A person who withdrew too long might find themselves gently questioned, then watched, then, if necessary, talked about until they returned to the fold. The cure for isolation was observation, and so visibility, the same force we spend our lives avoiding, was their guarantee of survival. To live here was to exist in full view, your needs and virtues laid bare, your flaws shared like weather. But constant exposure also demanded control of emotion. After all, if everyone saw everything, you had to learn which parts of yourself could safely exist in public light. And that lesson began at the hearth, where even anger had to burn quietly. Being seen wasn't vanity, it was survival. A person unnoticed was a person untethered, a shadow without warmth or witness. Inside that long, smoky corridor, the worst fate wasn't death or exile, but invisibility. You could survive hunger, sickness, even grief, but if no one looked for you, if your name stopped being spoken around the fire, you were already half gone. Life in constant view created its own kind of safety net. Everyone was someone's watcher. If an elder slept too late, if a child's cough deepened, if the smoke from one hearth stopped rising, someone noticed. The gaze of the community wasn't surveillance. It was care disguised as curiosity. Eyes replaced walls. Where privacy disappears, compassion grows teeth. To exist socially meant performing small acts of visibility. You swept your section, tended your fire, shared your stew, not to boast, but to prove continuity. Visibility was participation. The rhythm of daily life required witnesses, even for the smallest gestures. Eating alone felt unnatural, like trying to breathe without air. Reputation lived longer than any body. It wrapped around a person like scent, carried in stories that outlasted them. To be known as generous, patient, or amusing was better protection than locks or wealth. To be known as secretive was the social equivalent of rot. People didn't hide because secrecy was interpreted as illness, something festering, contagious. The cure, reabsorption into the noise of life, where your mistakes could be diluted by laughter and time. This visibility also functioned as a kind of mirror. When you were angry, you saw your anger reflected in the discomfort of those nearby. When you were joyful, the laughter echoed back. Every emotion was moderated by its audience. Privacy was unnecessary because community performed the work of conscience. Even solitude happened in public. A man grieving sat quietly beside the fire, head bowed, others passing by with soft words or none at all. His silence was respected, but not ignored. That's how mourning worked. Witnessed, contained, collectively managed. Pain without observation wasn't noble. It was dangerous. The line between privacy and abandonment was thin, and no one wanted to cross it. Children learned this quickly. They grew up knowing that to be unseen was to be unsafe. They sought attention not from ego but from instinct. Every cry guaranteed response, every story an audience. In that world, loneliness wasn't a mood, it was a threat. Even dreams were treated as communal property. Upon waking, a person might share what they'd seen in sleep, not as confession but as contribution. Dreams were warnings, omens, or jokes, depending on how they were told. Keeping them private would have been selfish, like hoarding food or hiding a fire. The irony, of course, is that such transparency bred subtlety. People became masters of restraint. They learned how to hide thoughts without hiding bodies, how to express frustration without breaking harmony. Privacy moved inward from space to mind. The house saw your actions, but not your motives. The result was an extraordinary emotional discipline, public composure, private complexity, and that, perhaps, was the quiet brilliance of their system. Constant exposure didn't erase individuality, it refined it. The self didn't disappear in the crowd, it was sculpted by it, the way a river shapes stone by endless touch. Still, this delicate equilibrium required constant management. All those eyes, all that closeness, it could turn tense fast. To survive together meant learning how to live with everyone's noise, moods, and tempers without letting the house collapse under the weight of emotion. And that's where etiquette began, not from civility, but from necessity. The fine art of keeping peace when escape was never an option. Emotions in a shared dwelling were like fire, essential, but always one spark away from disaster. You could laugh, cry, argue, even sulk, but everything had to be done at a sustainable volume. The walls were too thin for theatrics, the air too shared for rage. Anger couldn't be allowed to echo. It had to be managed like smoke, directed upward until it thinned. There were no locked doors to slam, no corridors to retreat down when your patience ran out. Privacy didn't exist, so self-control took its place. When irritation came, and it always did, you swallowed it like bitter medicine and learned to let silence do the heavy lifting. In a space where dozens of people slept shoulder to shoulder, sulking loudly was as taboo as spitting in the stew. Children learned this first. Cry too long, and you weren't punished, you were laughed at. That was the cultural safety valve. Humor, teasing diffused tension before it metastasized. Adults did the same. Sarcasm functioned as therapy. Laughter as ventilation. No one could afford grudges. The air was already too thick with breath and smoke to hold anything else. Every sound in that communal space had meaning. The sigh of someone weaving, the scrape of a pot, the low hum of a story told half asleep. Emotional outbursts didn't vanish, they were absorbed. When someone snapped, the house itself seemed to adjust its breathing, quieter, heavier, until calm returned. Collective living turned empathy into instinct. You didn't need to ask what someone felt. You could hear it in how they stirred the fire or set down a bowl. Even grief followed choreography. When death came, and it came often, mourning was both public and restrained. There was wailing, yes, but it was rhythmic, controlled, almost musical. Pain didn't isolate, it harmonized. The group absorbed it, redistributed it, transformed it into ritual. You weren't expected to mourn alone, and you weren't allowed to. That was considered dangerous. Grief untethered could break the balance of the house. Privacy, as a concept, would have looked selfish here. Emotional restraint wasn't repression, it was contribution. By holding yourself together, you protected others' peace. There was dignity and composure, even under duress. And because no one could hide for long, there was no point pretending. The community didn't expect stoicism, just moderation. Conflict resolution was another communal art. When tempers clashed, the argument became everyone's background noise, so it couldn't stay private. Neighbors would weigh in casually while sharpening tools or stirring pots. A dispute between two people became a performance, guided by audience participation until exhaustion replaced anger. Eventually, someone cracked a joke, and the matter dissolved under laughter and shared fatigue. If the modern world invented therapy rooms and meditation apps, this society invented emotional osmosis. Feelings circulated freely. Frustration entered one side of the room and left the other, diluted by empathy. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. No one drowned in their emotions because no one was allowed to swim alone. This public management of emotion shaped their psychology. It bred tolerance for closeness, patience for imperfection, and a kind of subtle emotional intelligence that came not from introspection, but from proximity. You couldn't escape the consequences of your moods, so you learned to temper them. And yet, that same closeness created a new kind of power, the power of gossip. When everyone hears everything, information becomes the real currency. Words could heal, but they could also destroy reputations faster than fire devoured bark. Gossip wasn't small talk here. It was law enforcement with better storytelling. Every shared roof carried an invisible network of whispers, each one threading its way through the rafters faster than smoke. Someone borrowed too much grain. Everyone knew before breakfast. A young couple argued too loudly. The details spread with the next round of corn cakes. No council, no courtroom, just an unrelenting, democratic murmur. It wasn't cruelty. It was governance by observation. In a world without locks or written laws, reputation did the heavy lifting. If people stopped talking about you, that was mercy. If they kept talking about you, that was survival. A scandal meant you still mattered. Silence meant exile in place, a social disappearance more terrifying than banishment. The system worked because it was constant. Each voice was a witness, each rumor a moral compass tilted slightly by bias and memory. Gossip enforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior better than any chief could. A thief might hide stolen food, but he couldn't hide his face. Laughter would follow him through every mealtime until shame wore him down into apology. Even truth was flexible. Accuracy mattered less than impact. A story's endurance proved its usefulness. The goal wasn't punishment, but equilibrium. A whispered tale that made people more cautious, more humble, more generous. That was considered a public good. The collective conscience spoke through rumor, and everyone listened, whether they wanted to or not. Sometimes, it was almost artistic. Elders could slice through pride with a few words disguised as anecdote. "Remember the man who built his own fire and burned his eyebrows off," they'd say, and everyone laughed, but the target always knew who the man was. Humor became jurisprudence. Teasing was regulation in disguise, a soft whip wrapped in warmth. When conflict rose beyond repair, there was mediation, but it didn't happen in private corners. It unfolded in plain sight, with spectators pretending to ignore while listening intently. Arguments were as communal as meals. The crowd's presence forced moderation. Too much shouting, and you embarrassed yourself. Too much pride, and you looked childish. Resolution arrived, not through authority but exhaustion and ridicule. Children watched this theater daily. They learned quickly that the safest path through life was not secrecy, but subtlety. You didn't hide your flaws. You displayed them modestly, in ways the community could forgive. Confession was social lubrication. It made you trustworthy again. Yes, I took an extra portion. Yes, I lost my temper. The words cost less than the silence they replaced. Of course, gossip had teeth. it could exile too. Repeated offenses, selfishness, deceit, violence spread like infection. At some point, a person could find their mat mysteriously move toward the edge of the hearthline, their name spoken less, their bowl passed last. That was the quiet verdict, not exiled by decree, but by gravity. You simply drifted out of relevance, and yet, the balance held. This endless cycle of chatter, correction, and redemption kept the social machinery greased. The same voices that condemned you one day might praise you the next for some small generosity. The community's memory was long, but its grudges were mercifully short. Still, even in such tight harmony, vulnerability was inescapable. Everyone's life was visible, every secret fragile. Illness, weakness, and despair couldn't be hidden, and that, strangely, was their greatest strength. Because when hardship struck, help came before you could ask. In a house without walls, misfortune had nowhere to hide. The first cough, the limp in a step, the way someone stirred their stew slower than usual, it was all noticed. Illness wasn't private business. It was a collective alarm. When one person weakened, the rest adjusted automatically, like muscles compensating for an injured limb. You didn't have to ask for help. The house itself reacted quietly, instinctively. That's what made survival possible. Dependency wasn't shameful, it was structural. Children didn't belong to parents alone. They belonged to the firelight, to the rhythm of the group. Elders weren't retired from usefulness. They were libraries wrapped in wrinkles, repositories of stories, warnings, and songs. When one faltered, another filled the gap. If a hunter fell sick, someone else took up his bow. If a mother died, her child never lacked arms to hold it. Death rearranged duties, not destinies. Grief, like everything else, was shared property. You couldn't lock yourself away to mourn. There was nowhere to go. Instead, loss became a ritual of endurance distributed across many bodies. Someone sang, someone cooked, someone sat nearby and said nothing at all. The weight was divided until it was bearable. It wasn't tenderness in the sentimental sense, it was logistics of the soul. This lack of privacy softened even the boundaries of the body. Midwives worked in half-light, surrounded by the low murmur of other women who had birthed before. The smell of sweat and cedar mixed with smoke. Life arrived publicly, greeted by dozens of eyes and the crackle of fire. Death left the same way, not hidden behind curtains or whispered about in corridors. Both transitions, entrance and exit, were treated as communal housekeeping, moments to be witnessed, not sanitized. When everything was shared, food, pain, warmth, breath, individualism had no soil to grow in. You couldn't afford to think of yourself as a separate unit. Your well-being was quite literally woven into others. The sound of your laughter could raise morale during hunger. Your silence could sink it. Your body's health affected the group's strength, your mood its cohesion. Privacy wasn't a right because it was a risk. To disappear from view was to weaken the chain. Even simple illness became a lesson in humility. The sight of a fevered child or an elder shaking beside the fire reminded everyone that survival depended less on strength than on solidarity. A house that could hold warmth could also hold weakness, and in doing so, it fortified itself. Compassion wasn't optional. It was survival strategy disguised as love, and there was an odd equality in that dependence. No one was untouchable. Even the most skilled hunter or most respected matriarch would one day need to be fed, bathed, or carried. Vulnerability circulated like currency. Today yours, tomorrow mine. To accept help was not to lose dignity, but to deposit trust back into the system. Of course, living in constant mutual observation meant that even tenderness was practical. A hand on a shoulder wasn't affection so much as reassurance. You're still part of the rhythm, still seen, still necessary. To vanish emotionally was as dangerous as vanishing physically. And yet, amid that openness, a strange paradox brewed. Bodies were public, but respect still existed. Modesty wasn't about hiding. It was about recognizing where the line between necessity and intrusion lay. Intimacy wasn't private, it was merely quiet. In a space where everyone saw everything, modesty took on a different shape. It wasn't about concealment, that was impossible, but about intention. Privacy didn't come from walls, it came from manners. Averted eyes, softened voices, a glance away at the right moment. These were the only curtains anyone had. Men and women moved through the same smoky corridors, past the same fires, under the same roof that smelled of cedar, ash, and humanity. Their bodies were no mystery, but that didn't mean they were public property. Familiarity bred a kind of reverence, rather than scandal. When there's no such thing as secrecy, respect becomes an unspoken choreography. Everyone learned where to look and when not to. Domestic intimacy unfolded under this constant awareness. Lovers didn't hide. They simply faded into the rhythm of night. The fire dimmed, voices hushed, and a subtle pact of discretion descended. No one needed to pretend ignorance, but everyone pretended courtesy. Desire wasn't a spectacle, it was a quiet fact of life, no more scandalous than cooking or weaving. The human body, stripped of privacy, also lost its shame. Gender itself was practical, not ideological. Tasks were divided, yes, but never rigidly. Women tended fires, prepared food, and cared for children, but they also traded, advised, and healed. Men hunted, built, and argued over boundaries, but they also wept, sang, and sat by cradles when needed. The community couldn't afford hierarchy. Efficiency, not purity, determined roles. When survival depends on everyone, no one gets to be ornamental. Clothing mirrored this balance, functional, layered, adapted to work and weather, not to virtue. You dressed for smoke, not modesty, for wind, not seduction. Yet even the act of dressing and undressing carried etiquette. It happened openly, but gracefully, with that same communal tact that replaced walls. Privacy wasn't physical, it was behavioral, negotiated moment by moment, through tone and restraint. Children grew up seeing everything human: birth, death, argument, reconciliation, affection. There were no forbidden scenes, only moments too sacred to interrupt. They learned modesty not through rules, but through imitation, by watching how adults maintained dignity and openness. It's ironic, the less there was to hide, the more carefully people carried themselves. The public body wasn't eroticized. It was functional, weathered, and known. The labor of survival sculpted it. Smoke-stained fingers, cracked heels, shoulders corded from work. Attraction existed, of course, but without the theater of concealment, it lost its sharpness. Mystery was replaced by recognition. You loved someone not for the novelty of their body, but for the familiarity of their movements, the way they split wood, laughed, stirred soup. And in this transparency, power dynamics softened. There was no hidden abuse, no secret affair that could go unseen. Visibility acted as protection. A man couldn't strike his partner without witnesses. A woman couldn't suffer quietly without intervention. Every action reverberated in the open air, judged and absorbed by many eyes. The body's exposure, paradoxically, became its safeguard. When everyone sees, no one hides long enough to harm unseen. Still, all this openness required a kind of internal discipline, a containment not of action, but of emotion. People learned to close the door inwardly, to keep thoughts private, even when bodies weren't. Solitude had to be invented inside the mind, and that quiet mental refuge, that ability to retreat while surrounded, became as vital to survival as food or fire. When life was lived in a single, shared breath, the mind became the only private room. You couldn't hide your body, your hunger, or your habits, but your thoughts could still disappear behind your eyes. That was the great adaptation, learning to be alone without leaving anyone's sight. Constant nearness changed how people thought. Introspection wasn't encouraged, but it emerged naturally from necessity. To survive in the middle of so much noise, you had to cultivate silence inside yourself. The constant chatter of fires, feet, and voices trained a kind of selective hearing, an ability to drift inward while still nodding at a conversation, to hear both the outer world and the inner one without mixing them up. This wasn't withdrawal, it was skill. Mental solitude became the only sustainable form of privacy. A person could sit surrounded by 20 others and vanish quietly into their own thoughts, unobserved, not because they were hidden, but because everyone else respected the art of not noticing. You learned to disappear politely, just enough to rest your mind without alarming anyone. The endless togetherness also made people sturdy in strange ways. Sensory overload became normal. The smell of smoke, the crackle of drying hides, the soft snores of children, the wet cough of someone fighting through winter. Instead of irritation, these became the background pulse of safety. The discomforts of proximity transformed into proof that life still hummed around you. Solitude would have felt like danger, too quiet, too still. too close to the kind of silence that meant something had gone wrong. Emotional regulation was part of that mental discipline. You couldn't afford outbursts, they echoed too far. So feelings had to be metabolized differently, slower, less dramatic, more deliberate. Anger cooled in motion, sadness worked itself out through routine. You didn't stew in solitude, you burned it off through usefulness. Maybe that's why these communities produced fewer brooding philosophers. When life is shared this closely, there's no room for self-absorption. But there was wisdom in that restraint. People became fluent in micro-emotions, the smallest changes in tone, the barely perceptible tension of a shoulder. You didn't need words to sense unease or affection. You read it from the air. Intuition replaced privacy. When you're surrounded constantly, you stop pretending and start perceiving. That same intuition helped them maintain balance between thought and belonging. They could think deeply without detaching, reflect without alienating. Their philosophy, if it could be called that, was one of quiet endurance, a mind calm enough to stay whole, even when the body was never alone. The idea of me time would have made them laugh. Individualism was a luxury for those who didn't have to worry about freezing to death. The self here was a membrane, not a fortress, porous, flexible, always adjusting to the rhythm of others. Privacy of thought existed only so that you could rejoin the group without breaking its flow. Still, that inner refuge mattered. It was what allowed people to maintain grace under constant exposure, to carry small private dreams, the next hunt, a future spouse, a remembered story, without losing them to the crowd. It was privacy distilled to its essence, the right to hold a secret without the need to hide it physically. Yet this balance between inner and outer worlds didn't come from philosophy but from survival. It was the only way to stay sane in a life where every moment was observed, every sound overheard, every action absorbed. And in that continuous exchange between minds and bodies, something spiritual began to form, an understanding that being seen by others wasn't the same as being known by them. The divine had no interest in privacy. Worship didn't happen behind closed doors or whispered into pillows, it burned in plain sight. The fire that cooked your dinner was also the altar. The breath that carried gossip also carried prayer. In a world where nothing was hidden, faith couldn't be either. The sacred existed in visibility, woven into the rhythm of life rather than set apart from it. Rituals happened right where life happened, at the same hearth where fish roasted, children argued, and stories stretched into the night. The sacred and the ordinary never learned to keep their distance. Blessings weren't special occasions. They were maintenance, small gestures repeated daily to keep balance between humans, ancestors, and whatever else was listening in the smoke. Everyone participated. There were no private confessions, no holy intermediaries whispering secrets to invisible gods. Sin wasn't a solitary concern, it was a communal imbalance. If something went wrong, a storm destroyed a crop, a child fell ill, the entire group sought the cause together. Someone might have broken a taboo, skipped a ritual, or offended a spirit. But the investigation was collective, the correction shared. The cosmos, much like the household, demanded cooperation. The architecture of openness mirrored the cosmology. Spirits, like people, preferred company. Ancestors lingered near the fire, hovering in the rising smoke. Every crackle might be a voice, every draft might be a sign. You didn't need solitude to feel divine presence, it was already there, baked into the wood and air. To seek isolation for worship would have seemed absurd, like trying to light a candle in sunlight. Even spiritual hierarchy dissolved in that visibility. A dream wasn't kept secret for personal revelation. It was shared at dawn, dissected collectively, folded into decision-making. The dreamer became messenger, but never owner. The sacred, like everything else, belonged to everyone. Transparency gave religion a peculiar honesty. There were no miracles staged in the dark, no hidden relics or private visions to be hoarded by a chosen few. Faith relied on witness, not blind belief, but shared observation. When something inexplicable happened, a sudden recovery, an animal behaving strangely, an unexpected gift of rain, it was discussed openly, interpreted communally, recorded in memory. Mystery existed, but never ownership of it. And perhaps that's why superstition thrived, not as fear, but as etiquette. When everyone shared the same space, even invisible forces were expected to follow social norms. The spirits were part of the household, expected to behave and be respected in return. You didn't pray to control them. You included them. the same way you'd offer food to a guest or step quietly around a sleeping elder. It's striking how visibility, instead of diminishing reverence, deepened it. The sacred was less about awe and more about maintenance, like tending a relationship that never ended. A lapse in respect could ripple through the community and the environment alike. Privacy wasn't needed to feel close to the divine. Connection required witnesses, breath, and sound. Even death remained transparent. Burial or mourning was never secretive. The entire community stood as intermediary between worlds. The body's transformation from warmth to stillness, from presence to memory, happened in public light, watched with solemn There was no mystique, only continuity. In this transparency, spirituality became a collective sense-making system. Faith wasn't an escape from the visible world, it was its reflection. You didn't find the divine by retreating inward, you found it by looking around. And through that shared gaze, something larger than belief emerged, a philosophy of balance where being seen was sacred, and invisibility was the only form of death that truly mattered. Over time, what began as necessity became something close to wisdom. The lack of privacy, the endless sharing, the constant exposure, all of it hardened into philosophy, like clay baked into meaning by fire. The people who lived this way didn't set out to design a worldview. It just grew around them, as naturally as moss on wood. They learned early that walls, both literal and emotional, were liabilities. You couldn't barricade yourself against hunger, winter, or grief, so why try? Isolation was the first symptom of sickness, not strength. To vanish from the communal rhythm was to invite disaster. The individual who thought they could stand alone was the one who froze first, starved first, or went mad from silence. Survival demanded permeability, so openness became the default, and over generations, the default became doctrine. The idea that a human life should be visible, witnessed, intertwined, that was the moral order. Not because it was sentimental, but because it worked. Transparency built resilience, and interdependence became the highest form of intelligence. It was a quiet philosophy, not carved into stone or preached by sages. You could only find it in gestures, a bowl passed without words, a fire rekindled without being asked, a quarrel ended with a joke instead of punishment. Kindness wasn't a virtue, it was a survival strategy dressed up as grace. Even nature obeyed the same ethic. The forest gave freely but expected reciprocity. Trees provided bark for walls, animals provided food, rivers offered passage, and in return, everything was used with restraint. To take more than needed wasn't just greedy, it was cosmologically stupid. The world was watching, and so was everyone else. In that collective gaze, people found meaning. They didn't measure life in achievements or possessions, but in relationships maintained and fires kept burning. Privacy would have looked wasteful, a hoarding of energy that should circulate. A closed mind, like a closed room, just filled with smoke. Their version of freedom was the opposite of ours. It wasn't escape from others, it was trust in others. True autonomy came from being so woven into the group that you didn't need to defend yourself. You were safe precisely because you were seen. Of course, that kind of safety required constant humility. The self had to stay small enough to fit among others, flexible enough to bend with them. Pride, secrecy, withdrawal. These were the moral equivalents of rot. They weakened the structure. A community wasn't a sum of individuals. It was a single organism, breathing through many lungs. Even memory operated communally. A person lived on through stories, gestures, and habits absorbed by others. Privacy couldn't protect identity. Only remembrance could. To be known was to persist. To be forgotten was to dissolve. It's tempting to call this utopia, but it wasn't soft or idyllic. It was brutal in its own way. You couldn't hide your shame, your grief, your failures. But the trade was fair. In exchange for exposure, you were never alone. And that may have been the ultimate lesson, that survival, stripped of pride and pretense, depends less on strength than on transparency. The house, the fire, the body, the soul, all of them open systems, sustained by flow. When privacy meant nothing, life meant everything.